I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me when the email arrived. It was a Tuesday morning. Ordinary enough. The kind of morning where nothing feels like it's about to change. The subject line read, "Mortgage application status update." I clicked it without thinking twice. The loan officer's message was polite, professional, the kind of careful language people use when they're delivering news they don't enjoy. She wrote that my application had been flagged during the credit review. There was an existing mortgage tied to my Social Security number, a property in Naperville, Illinois, purchased 14 months ago. She needed me to clarify my ownership stake before they could proceed. I read it twice, then a third time. I didn't own a property in Naperville. I had never purchased a home in my life. That was the entire reason I was applying for a mortgage in the first place. My hands were steady when I set the mug down, but something in my chest had gone very still, the way a room goes quiet right before a thunderstorm. I pulled up my credit report. There it was, a 30-year mortgage, $340,000, opened 14 months ago. The address was on a street I recognized immediately, a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburb I'd driven to dozens of times for Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. It was my parents' new house, the one my mother had called our fresh start when the family moved there 2 years ago, the one I had been quietly wiring money toward every single month. I sat there for a long time with the screen glowing in front of me, listening to the sound of traffic outside and a neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the block. I thought about all the times my mother had called it the family home, the way she said it, soft and warm, like an invitation. I thought about how I'd never questioned it. I'd just kept sending the money. Growing up, my brother was the one people noticed. He was 3 years younger and had the kind of easy confidence that made teachers forgive late assignments and coaches overlook missed practices. My mother used to cup his face in her hands and tell him he was going to do something great someday. She said it so often it stopped sounding like a prediction and started sounding like a contract. My father would watch from the doorway and nod slowly, like he was witnessing something sacred. I was the other one. Not the difficult one, not the troubled one, just the steady one. The one who got straight A's without anyone asking to see her report card. The one who worked 20 hours a week through high school and put half of every paycheck into a savings account without being told. When I got a full scholarship to DePaul, my mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," then immediately pivoted to asking whether I could help my brother study for his SATs. He was retaking them for the 3rd time. I told myself families were like that. Someone always pulls the cart while someone else steers. I told myself it didn't matter because we loved each other, and love was the whole point. By the time I was 26, I had a steady salary as a financial analyst, a 1-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, and a habit of answering every phone call from home within the first 2 rings. My brother had cycled through 4 jobs, 2 cities, and 1 very expensive semester at a private film school that he dropped out of after 8 weeks. My mother called me when the tuition refund fell short. She said she hated to ask. She asked anyway. I sent the money. I always did. The thing about being the responsible one is that nobody ever sits you down and explains the rules. You just absorb them slowly. The way you absorb anything that happens every day, the sun rising, the seasons turning, the certainty that when something goes wrong, your name will be the first one called. It becomes your identity before you realize you agreed to it. When my parents decided to sell the old house and move to Naperville, my mother framed it as a family decision. She called a Sunday dinner, poured wine, and described the new property like she was reading from a travel brochure: 3 bedrooms, a big backyard, a neighborhood where they could finally breathe. My father sat at the head of the table nodding along. My brother was quiet in a way I didn't read carefully enough. "We need a little help with the down payment," my mother said, reaching over to touch my hand. "Just to get us started. You know we'll pay it back." I wrote the check for $28,000 3 days later. Then the monthly transfers started. My mother said the mortgage payments were higher than expected. "Just a bridge," she said. "Just until your father's pension kicks in fully." I set up an automatic transfer of $1,400 every month and watched it leave my account like clockwork. I told myself it was what families did. That was 2 years ago. Now I was staring at a credit report that showed the property registered in my brother's name, with my Social Security number listed as a co-borrower I had never agreed to be. I closed the laptop, picked up my coffee, and poured it down the sink. Then I went to get dressed, because I knew I needed to talk to a lawyer before I talked to anyone in my family. Her name was Patricia, and she'd been referred to me by a colleague who described her as the kind of attorney who didn't waste words. She had a small office near the Loop, diplomas on one wall, and the practiced calm of someone who'd heard a great many things that shouldn't have been possible. I told her everything in 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a legal pad with quick, deliberate strokes. When I finished, she looked up and said, "Someone used your identity to secure a mortgage without your consent. That's fraud." I already knew that, hearing it said plainly, in a quiet office with afternoon light coming through the blinds, still knocked the air out of me. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know yet. I needed to understand exactly what had happened first. She pulled the full property record that afternoon. My brother was listed as primary borrower. My name and social security number appeared as co-borrower, with a signature that looked enough like mine that I had to look twice. The document was dated 6 weeks after I'd written the down payment check, 6 weeks after I'd handed over $28,000, believing I was helping my parents settle into a home that belonged to all of us. Patricia set the pages on the desk between us and folded her hands. "The monthly transfers you've been making," she said carefully, "have been going directly toward the mortgage payment on a property your brother owns." I looked out the window at the street below. A woman was walking a small dog. A delivery truck was double parked at the corner. Everything outside looked completely normal, and I thought how strange it was that the world didn't pause when something broke inside it. I asked Patricia to give me a week before we filed anything. She said she understood, but to be careful about what I said to the family before we had a strategy. "Don't confront them with the documents yet," she told me. "People do unpredictable things when they feel cornered." I drove home in the dark, took a long shower, and sat on the edge of my bed for a while. I thought about my brother at that Sunday dinner, how quiet he'd been. I thought about the way he'd avoided my eyes when my mother was describing the house. I'd read it as his usual discomfort with sincerity. I understood now it was something else entirely. My phone lit up with a message from my mother. "Just checking in, honey. Are you coming Sunday?" I typed back that I'd try, and stared at the message until the screen went dark. The next few days I spent in a kind of careful suspension, going to work and answering emails and making coffee and doing all the ordinary things while underneath it, something was quietly rearranging itself. I went back through years of bank records. The transfers were all there, clean and documented, every one of them labeled family support in my own notes. I printed them out and organized them by year into a folder I kept in the drawer of my nightstand. 8 months of records, 14 months of mortgage payments, a down payment that had gone directly into my brother's property, a grand total that I calculated on a Saturday morning sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor, and when I saw the number I had to put the pen down and breathe for a minute. $62,400, plus the down payment, over $90. I had been paying my brother's mortgage for over a year without knowing it existed. I called my mother that Sunday and told her I was coming for dinner. She sounded pleased, slightly relieved, the way she always did when I came around after a quiet spell. She said she was making pot roast. She said my brother would be there too. I said that was fine. The drive to Naperville took 40 minutes. The house looked pleasant in the early evening light. Brick front, mature trees in the yard, a welcome mat at the front door that my mother had bought at a craft fair and been proud of. I sat in the driveway for a moment before going in. I thought about Patricia's advice. I had the documents in a folder in my bag, but I wasn't going to open it tonight. Tonight I was just going to watch. Dinner was the way family dinners always are when everyone is performing normalcy. My mother moved between the kitchen and the table with practiced efficiency, filling glasses and redirecting conversation whenever it drifted toward anything real. My father ate quietly and asked about my job in a way that suggested he was asking because he'd remembered to, not because he was especially curious. My brother was cheerful in the louder-than-necessary way he got when he was covering something up. I'd known that version of him since we were kids. He talked about a new freelance project, a possible opportunity, something he was thinking about exploring. He always had something he was thinking about exploring. My mother nodded at everything he said with the attentive warmth of an audience that never tires of the performance. I ate my pot roast and asked polite questions and said very little. Before I left, my mother walked me to the door and squeezed my arm. "It means so much that you're always there for this family," she said. "I don't know what we'd do without you." I smiled. I said goodnight. I drove home in the dark, listening to the radio turned low, and thought about how long she'd been saying that exact thing, and how long I'd let it be enough. 2 days later, I called my aunt. She was my father's older sister, and she had always been the quiet margin note of our family observant, in a way that made people slightly uncomfortable, the kind of woman who never said much but remembered everything. She picked up on the second ring and said she'd been wondering when I'd call. I asked her what she meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something you should know about the house." She told me carefully, in the measured way she had of delivering difficult things, that she'd been present at a conversation 6 months ago between my mother and my brother. They'd been discussing what would happen if I ever asked to be added to the deed. My mother had said, very calmly, that I'd signed the paperwork already and wouldn't question it. My brother had said he just needed another year before things stabilized, and then they'd figure out a way to compensate me. My mother had said she'll be fine. She always lands on her feet. My aunt said she hadn't known what to do with that information until now. I thanked her. I told her I was handling it. She said she knew I was, and that she was sorry she hadn't said something sooner. I went back to Patricia the next morning. She had already prepared the preliminary filing. She walked me through it with the same quiet efficiency as before. We were pursuing 3 things: fraud, for the use of my identity without consent to secure the mortgage; financial exploitation, for the misrepresentation of the down payment and monthly transfers; and a formal claim on the property, given the documented source of the funds. She said that depending on how they responded, we might also be looking at forgery. I signed where she indicated. She told me they'd be served within the week. I asked what I should do until then. She said, "Live your life, don't reach out, let the process work." I went home and I sat in my apartment, which I had chosen and paid for and filled with things that were entirely mine. And for a long time I didn't do anything at all. I thought about the version of myself who had written that first check without a second thought. I didn't feel angry at her. She'd been doing what she believed families did. She'd been operating on a set of rules nobody had handed her, rules she'd assembled herself from years of watching how love was distributed and what was expected in return. The process served them on a Thursday. I know because my mother called me at 7:30 that evening, her voice tight and higher than usual, and asked if I'd lost my mind. I said, "Hello, Mom." She said she couldn't believe I would do this to the family. She said my brother was devastated. She said my father had barely spoken since the papers arrived. She said everything we'd built, everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed, and her voice cracked on that word, sacrificed, was being torn apart because of me. I waited until she'd finished. Then I said, "You used my social security number to put my brother on a mortgage without telling me. You took $28,000 from me and told me it was for the family. You let me wire money every month for over a year to pay a debt I didn't know I owed. That's what tore things apart. I'm just the one saying it out loud." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in years. Then she said, "We were going to tell you." I said, "When?" She didn't answer. I heard her breathing, and in it, I could hear the whole architecture of her reasoning, the incremental decisions that had seemed small in the moment, the growing certainty that I would absorb it all the way I always had, the fundamental miscalculation that the version of me who asked no questions would last forever. I said, "I love you. I'll talk to you when the lawyers are done." Then I hung up. My brother called 20 minutes later. He went a different direction, conciliatory, half apologetic, the voice he used when he was trying to find a solution that didn't cost him anything. He said he could explain. He said it was more complicated than it looked. He said Mom had pushed the whole thing and he'd just gone along with it, which was a strange kind of confession wrapped in a stranger kind of excuse. He said he was going to make it right. I asked him what making it right looked like in his mind. He started talking about timelines, about what was realistic, about the market and his situation, and how it wouldn't be fair to upend everything overnight. I said, "Talk to my attorney," and ended the call. I didn't sleep well that week. Not because I was afraid of what was coming, but because grief has its own schedule and it doesn't wait for convenient times. I'd lie awake thinking about Sunday dinners that I now had to reframe the warmth I'd felt when my mother said we couldn't do it without you, the quiet pride I'd carried for years at being the dependable one, the person the family could count on. I had thought that was a form of love. I understood now that it had been a form of use. The two things can look identical from the inside until something cracks open and you finally see the difference. My father came to my apartment on a Friday night without calling first. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked smaller than I remembered, the way people do when the armor comes off. I let him in. He sat on the couch with a mug of tea he barely touched and was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd known about the paperwork. Not at the start, he said, not when the down payment happened, but he'd found out later, and he hadn't said anything, and he was sorry. I asked him why. He said he didn't want to make things worse. He said the family was already fragile in ways I couldn't see. He said my mother had convinced him it was temporary, that everything would be restructured once my brother got on his feet, that I'd understand eventually because I always understood. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at me like a man who'd been waiting a long time to be held accountable and wasn't sure he deserved the relief of it. I said, "You let them use me because you thought I could take it." He said, "Yes." I said, "That's not love, Dad. That's just betting on someone being too tired to fight back." He didn't argue. He finished his tea, left, and sent me a text from his car that said, "I'm going to tell your mother this has to stop." I didn't know what that meant in practical terms. I knew it wasn't nothing. The mediation hearing was set for 6 weeks later. Patricia briefed me the morning before. She said the other side had made contact and signaled they were open to resolution outside of court, which she translated for me as, "They've seen the documents, and they know how this looks." She said we were in a strong position. The paper trail was clean, the signature discrepancy was verifiable, and the recording my aunt had described taken on her own phone without realizing she'd started it, sitting in her car in my parents' driveway, turned out to be usable as corroborating evidence. I asked how she'd gotten the recording. Patricia smiled slightly. She said my aunt had sent it the day after I called her. She said she had a feeling it might matter. The hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined. Round table, neutral walls, a mediator who introduced herself and explained the process in the tone of someone who'd explained it hundreds of times. My mother sat across from me in a blazer she usually reserved for events she wanted to look serious at. My brother was beside her, looking at the table. My father sat slightly apart from them, which was the most telling thing about the entire arrangement. Patricia laid out the summary without drama. The fraudulent co-borrower filing, the down payment misrepresentation, the sustained monthly transfers, the property value that had appreciated in 14 months, which meant the equity built on my money had grown. My mother's attorney offered a settlement, Patricia countered. They went back and forth twice. My mother watched me the whole time with an expression that kept shifting between grief and calculation. And I held very still and looked back at her without anger, because the anger had burned itself out somewhere in those quiet weeks, and what was left was something cleaner and colder and far more durable. When the numbers were finally settled, it included full reimbursement of every transfer, the down payment, and a cash equity payment reflecting my documented contribution to the property's value. The deed transfer was also formalized in the agreement the property would remain my brother's, but the terms were explicit, and nothing of mine was attached to it anymore. My mother signed last. Her hand shook slightly. She didn't look up. Walking out into the afternoon light, Patricia put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "You did well." I thanked her and walked to my car and sat there for a while watching pigeons on a ledge across the street. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 months ago, sitting at her kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, reading a mortgage notification that rearranged everything she thought she knew. I thought about all the ways I could have let this go, the paths I could have taken that led back to Sunday dinners, and the maintenance of a peace that was never actually peaceful. I didn't regret the path I'd chosen, but I understood for the first time how much energy it takes to stop being the person everyone else relied on to keep their story intact. I restarted my mortgage application the following week. My credit was clean. The fraudulent co-borrower filing had been officially disputed and removed. The loan officer called to apologize for the delay. I thanked her and said it was fine. The apartment I bought is in Wicker Park, top floor of a 3-flat, with windows that face west and catch the afternoon light in a way that makes the whole living room glow. I painted the walls myself on a Saturday in October, music playing, windows open, a particular kind of quiet that I have since come to recognize as the sound of a life that belongs entirely to you. My brother and I don't talk often. We text occasionally. The careful, surface-level messages of two people navigating their way back from something that changed the shape of things between them. He's getting there, I think, in his own slow way. There's a version of a relationship with him that might be possible someday, one built on something honest, without my playing a role I didn't choose. I'm not in a rush. My mother is harder. There are phone calls now, shorter than before, and she has learned to speak to me without the layer of expectation she used to coat every sentence in. It isn't warmth exactly, but it's more real than what we had. And I've decided that real is worth more than warm when warm has been covering something cold for a very long time. My father drives up to see me sometimes. He brings things from the garden, tomatoes in September, apples in October, and we sit on my new couch and talk about ordinary things until we've talked enough of the ordinary things away and we can say something true. He told me last month that he was proud of me. I told him I knew. I also told him I needed him to do better, not for me but for himself, because a man who watches someone get used is slowly becoming someone who doesn't want to look in the mirror. He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded. That kind of nod matters. I'm watching to see if it holds. I started volunteering with a financial literacy program on Tuesday evenings, a nonprofit that works with young women who've been pulled into family debt situations they didn't fully understand. I tell them things I wish someone had told me earlier: how to read documents before you sign them, how to spot the language of manipulation dressed up as love, how to say, "Let me think about it," and mean it, and how to say no and hold the line when the pressure starts. Last week, a woman in her late 20s told me she'd been wiring money to her parents for 3 years, and every time she asked about the arrangement, they changed the subject. She looked at me like she already knew the answer and was hoping I'd tell her she was wrong. I said, "You're not wrong, and you're not alone." She cried a little. I let her. I've learned that the story doesn't end when the legal part ends. There's a longer and quieter process of figuring out what you actually believe about love and family and the obligations that run between people who share a history. I don't have clean answers to those questions. I'm not sure clean answers exist. What I have is a clearer sense of where I end and where other people's needs begin, and the ability to hold that line with something other than apology. Some nights I sit by those west-facing windows with a glass of wine and watch the light go out of the sky in stages orange, then pink, then a deep blue that slowly fills in from the top down. I think about the version of myself who wrote that first check, who set up that automatic transfer, who drove to Sunday dinners and smiled at a table that was eating her alive. I don't have contempt for her. She was doing the best she could with the map she'd been given. I just have a different map now. One I drew myself. If you've ever been the one your family counted on to fix things, to absorb the cost, to ask no questions and keep the peace, I want you to know that there's a version of your life on the other side of that role that nobody told you about. It's quieter. It's smaller in some ways and enormous in others. It asks you to grieve the story you thought you were living before you can fully step into the one that's actually yours. But it's real. Every bit of it is real. And real, I've found, is the only thing worth building on.